as Easter comes, I thought I would just go over a few things that I believe we should meditate upon as we think about the whole purpose of Easter. You see, we really shouldn't even call it Easter. We should call it Resurrection Day, because we celebrate on that day the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It happened on the Feast of the First Fruits, because he is the first fruit of those that were raised into eternal body, an eternal physical body that's been glorified. He was the first in Jesus, in his humanity, to ever be brought into that resurrection of the physical body. And so that's what we celebrate on that day that has come to be called Easter. But I think it's important to realize that one of the great proofs that God sets forth about the truth of everything he says about Jesus Christ is the resurrection. And, the apostles preached that as one of the solemn evidences that everything was true when they set forth the circumstantial evidences of the resurrection. So in Matthew chapter 27, beginning with verse 62, we read this, and this sets the stage for checking out the circumstantial evidences for the resurrection. These are the very circumstances, by the way, that many great legal minds have checked out in the past. And they have written books on this, that this would stand up in any court today, that there are more evidences of the resurrection of Christ than any event in ancient history, if you're intellectually honest with the facts. And of course, some say, well, how do you know you have the facts? How can we be sure that these were accurately stated? Well, it would have been just as difficult for somebody to make up and write all of these things as it would be to just believe that God put them there. It would be virtually impossible. Now, here's what Jesus said, or I should say what was said about him. Jesus has been crucified, and his followers have put him in a tomb. And so this is what it says. Now on the next day, which is the one after the preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees gathered together with Pilate, who was then the governor, the Roman governor. And he said, "Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days, I'm to rise again.'" This is a claim that Jesus made. He didn't say that he would be raised ethereally or spiritually. No, he said his physical body was going to be raised from the dead 3 days after he was crucified and put in the grave. Now that's something that could be checked. And we have to stop and think. Jesus, many times in the Gospels, hurled this challenge out there. He challenged them. He said, when you see me raised after 3 days, then you will know that everything I said was true. In other words, he hazarded the truth or falseness of everything he lived for, died for, everything he taught, on the claim that he would be raised bodily from the dead in 3 days. So, these brilliant religious leaders, Pharisees and Sadducees, the leaders of the Jewish religion, they brought this up before Pilate. They said, listen, this deceiver said he would be resurrected 3 days after he was put in the grave. So they said, we need to make sure that his tomb is secured so that his followers cannot come and steal the body away and then go around claiming he was raised from the dead. That shows he claimed a bodily resurrection, by the way, because they were concerned about keeping the body in the tomb. Okay? So, in verse 64, "Therefore give orders for the grave to be made secure until the 3rd day, lest the disciples come and steal him away and say to the people, 'He has risen from the dead.' And the last deception will be worse than the first. They were playing upon Pilate's ambition here. You know, Pilate was a very clever, ambitious Roman leader, and he was in Judea because if you could do a good job in Judea, you would be catapulted into being considered as a senator in Rome. And so he didn't want anything to blight his record. That's the reason he let the crowd talk him into condemning a man that he claimed to be innocent. He said Jesus was a man he found no fault in. And in spite of that, they kept saying, if you don't put this man to death, we will tell Rome. And the Caesar will declare you a friend of those that were promoting insurrection. And so he knew his career would be over. That's the reason he waffled, and he made a show of washing his hands before the crowd and saying, I wash my hands of this because I see no fault in him. He knew his career was on the line here, and they were clever enough to play upon that. Here's what Pilate said to him. Now listen to every word of this, because this is very important. Pilate said to them, you have a guard. Literally, it would be understood today in the original Greek, and this is what it could be translated as. Take a guard. It's in the imperative mood. Take a guard. Go make it as secure as you know how. So he gave them full authority to make it as secure as they could. And it's important that he said, take a guard, because the word that is used concerning the soldiers that were on guard in chapter 28 of Matthew, and in the other accounts of it too, are words that mean Roman soldiers in the Roman legion. He gave them authority to take that. And of course, this is what we would call today a maximum security case. So they had full authority to do whatever they wanted. They took a quaternion of Roman soldiers, the word that's used is that, a quaternion of Roman soldiers to guard the tomb. They had a watch usually of 12 hours each, 2 watches a day. They put a watch there of 16 soldiers. A quaternion was 16 Roman legionnaires, battle-hardened. They were of the Roman 10th Legion. Here's what it says. And they went and made the grave secure along with the guard. And here's the quaternion. And they set a seal on the stone. Interesting, it says they set a seal. Do you know what that was? This is a word that's very well known in the ancient world. The tomb, like all tombs of that day that were elaborately done, it was carved out of a solid rock face. And there was a cavern-like thing carved out of rock, where they would put a body. And the garden tomb where Jesus was placed was like that. And they usually had a big round rock, like a big cylinder, that was at least 1 foot to 2 feet thick. And they'd hack it out and make it round so it could be rolled into place. And they would have a little trough in front of the wall of the tomb where they could roll this circular stone. They could roll it, and they would have a little notch like in front of the tomb so that it would drop into that notch when it rolled into place. Now, it would roll against the face of the rock tomb. And once they put that in place, then they would take 2 dabs of hot wax. One they would put on the wall of the tomb. The other they would put on the stone that was rolled into place in front of the tomb. Then they would stretch a card across and press it into the hot wax. Then they would put the seal of that time, Tiberius Caesar, on that wax. Now that meant, you'd say, well, how could a simple card mean anything to somebody who wanted to rob a grave. Well, here's what it meant. Once they saw that seal, they knew, because they were subjects of Rome, they knew that if you break that seal, all the power of Rome is going to come after you. 16 Roman guards, the seal of Tiberius Caesar placed over it, and everyone knew it was instant death if you broke it. They'd catch you, they'd put you to death on a cross. So that's how they sealed it. And the Bible tells us about that. Now, what happened after that? Well, they had the soldiers there, and in the middle of the night of what we would call the seventh day, Sunday, in the middle of the night, it became their seventh day, or Sunday for us, began on sundown, and sundown of the sixth day, which we call Saturday. And so sometime between the sundown on Saturday, which became Sunday, and the early morning hours of Sunday, the body disappeared. And it says, and all the accounts say this, that the Roman soldiers were terrified because once the body was taken out, an angel came and rolled the stone back and sat on it. And the soldiers saw this. Now, these are battle-trained soldiers. And by the way, you look in, as I have many times studied it, the Institutes of the Roman Legions by Vegetius. It's in the Military Classics series, because it's funny that modern armies study the institutions of the Roman legions. What made them great? What made them able, a couple of legions be able to take on 20-1 odds against them and defeat them? Well, in that in those institutes, it says very clearly that if a Roman legionnaire failed on watch, he was executed immediately. Now, that tends to give you insomnia. If you're on watch, you're not going to fall asleep. Especially 16 men, 16 veteran legionnaires were on watch at the time that stone was rolled back. They knew that their lives were on the stake. You see, they knew that a centurion of the guard would, like it would be in every watch, especially a maximum security watch, would come to check on them unannounced from time to time. And they knew that if they were found asleep, the first thing that centurion would do would be to set their toga on fire. And when they suddenly awoke, he would have a sword going right down here over the top of their armor. He'd put them to death with a sword immediately on the spot. So there couldn't have been 16 men asleep. And yet, this is the only explanation that the religious leaders ever gave. They said, the Roman soldiers were terrified. I'm sure they checked in the grave to see that there was no body there. And then they fled for their lives. Some of them just fled and deserted and tried to disappear into the far-flung flanks of the Roman Empire in the east. Others came to the religious leaders and said, please save us. This is what happened. We don't know what to do. And so the religious leaders told them, tell everybody that we were asleep on watch. And while we were asleep, the disciples of Jesus came and stole the body. Well, would that hold water anywhere? First of all, you've got to consider that these are Roman legionnaires, veterans. Even if one or two of them fell asleep, their own soldiers would have put them to death, because that's a death for falling asleep. But for all 16 of them to be asleep? Please. And then you have to take into account this. Let's just pretend that, they were all asleep. So here comes some of Jesus' disciples. Now, what had they done just a couple of days before? They had all been in terror and afraid and forsook the very one they claimed to be their Lord. They were all hiding and cowering. They were terrified. How do they suddenly get the bravery to go up against 16 battle-trained legionnaires and go just to steal a corpse? Why would they risk their life for a corpse? What could they do with it? It would mean that it was all a lie anyway, because they knew that Jesus had claimed that he would come alive again. So, but let's say that they were stupid enough to do this, and somehow they got enough bravery to go. And so here they are. Here are 16 legionnaires all around the tomb, and they go up and they roll this. By the way, this has been weighed out several times by those that study those tombs. I've even seen some of the round rock discs that they put before tombs. They're still there. And it's estimated that that rock would weigh between 1.5 tons and 2 tons. Now here is, let's say, a 2-ton rock leaning hard against a rock face. Now they break the seal, knowing that means crucifixion, and they get together and they grunt and they roll the stone back. Have you ever heard the noise that would be caused by rock pushed hard against the other and rolling against the face of a tomb? Wow. No one could have slept through that, especially when they knew their necks were at stake if they fell asleep on duty. No, none of it makes sense. Absolutely none of it makes sense. The only answer is what the apostles gave, and that is, just as Jesus predicted he would, he came alive on the third day. And he appeared to them, and he appeared several times. At one point, over 500 of his disciples not only saw him, but they touched him, they talked with him, they ate with him, and then they saw him bodily ascend to heaven. And that was a testimony they gave despite all tortures. And listen, most of the apostles and many of the disciples died horrible deaths of torture. Not one of them ever recanted on their testimony of what they had seen. They died. And it's even, we know that Peter was crucified, and he said, I'm not worthy to be crucified in the same position of my Lord. He made him crucify him upside down. And the Apostle John was one of the last to be executed. He was boiled in oil, according to what extra-biblical history says about him in Ephesus. So, not one of them ever recanted and denied that they had seen Jesus bodily alone. Now, that's what is the message on Easter. Because Jesus Christ came back from the dead, because he is in an eternal resurrection human body and his human nature. You and I have the guarantee we're going to have that too. Every time you think about the resurrection of Jesus, just realize death has lost its power. The fear of death should not be something that bothers a Christian. Oh yeah, it's a strange thing. It's the great step into the unknown. But God says, the moment you leave this human body, your spirit goes to be face to face with Jesus Christ. Think about that, because that's the real message of Easter. Eshtar. Resurrection Day. God bless you. And I pray that you have a wonderful Resurrection Day.